The world has gathered in a car park in Glasgow, now decked with a tented city, teeming with polluters, climate change victims and campaigners.
That carbon footprint is about 6.
There was news coverage of the climate change horrors already around us and speeches to shock the richest nations into action.
4 degrees and we say goodbye to whole cities. Miami, Alexandria, Shanghai, all lost beneath the waves. Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now.
How many more voices and how many more pictures of people must we see on these screens without being able to move? Or are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity?
With more than 120 leaders here, they've built 2 main halls to get through 2 days of opening speeches simultaneously. But the words are still waiting for policies to match the crisis. The Rio summit 30 years ago kicked off a collective global response to the outcry from science over carbon emissions. But those emissions continued to grow through high-profile, mass-attended meeting after meeting. Binding targets were eventually agreed. The policy commitments needed to deliver them still haven't happened.
All those promises will be nothing but blah, 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 to coin a phrase. And the anger and the impatience of the world will be uncontainable unless we make this COP26 in Glasgow the moment when we get real about climate change.
Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
The UN Secretary-General said he now wanted countries summoned back for meetings like this one every year, each time required to ratchet up their commitments on climate change policies. And some now think meetings, whether they're every year or every 2 years, could be the main achievement that comes out of this meeting. India is one of the countries that'll take some convincing on that. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, one of the last major players to announce his nationally determined contribution, what India's actually going to do to bring down emissions.
By 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero emissions.
China didn't increase its promised policies, but COP26 has lost one world leader from the cast list who rejected the whole process.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
And I guess I shouldn't apologize, but I do apologize for the fact the United States, the last administration, pulled out of the Paris Accord.
A little earlier, the strains of the day telling on the 78-year-old president. An aide, maybe alerted to the situation, steps in with a message. The 95-year-old Sir David Attenborough said human ingenuity must be deployed to solve the crisis. Prince Charles repeated his plea to the G20 leaders in Rome yesterday.
We have to put ourselves on what might be called a warlike footing.
Some focus on the commitments still not made, some on those absent from the throng here, the leaders of China, Russia, Turkey, Brazil. But this is an attempt to turn round the basis of much of the world's economies. Monumental work, slow and far from done.
Well, Christiana Figueres was the United Nations climate chief at that historic conference in Paris in 2015, where nations first agreed to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
I have been saying for a long time, we must, we can, and I used to say we will. Today we can say we did, and I thank you all.
I'll try. Well, Christiana Figueres is the founding partner of Global Optimism, and she joins me now. We heard what you said back in 2015. So I wonder, since then, what has happened to We Did?
Well, in 2015, nations did agree to the legally binding common pathway to decarbonizing the global economy. That was the mandate in Paris. Now, they also, by the way, in Paris, registered their first set of commitments toward that global effort. This conference is very different. This is not about a universally agreed structure or pathway. This is about registering the second set of national contributions to the global effort of decarbonizing.
And India's net zero target is 2070, 2 decades later than the COP target. China has made no new pledges, so isn't it then futile to think that we can still limit warming to that 1.5 degrees set out at Paris?
Well, obviously, the announcement from Prime Minister Modi is disappointing because he himself knows that increasing emissions is actually increasing poverty. He knows that fully well. So one wonders why he put a 27 target. But in addition to that, we have to understand that the process that we are witnessing here is a completely imperfect, but already flowing, virtuous cycle where governments set out what they intend to do, and the private sector and the finance sector comes in to support that decarbonization.
But can we still do 1.5?
Yes.
How?
Yes, we can still do 1.5 because science has said very clearly that in order to be able to get to 1.5, and that has to still be front and center, we have to halve emissions by 2030. That is not where we are now, but the vulnerable countries have already called for this exercise, not the full COP, obviously, but for the exercise of coming forward with more commitments to actually be undergone now, not in a 5-year cycle, but every year. Because
but China hasn't even showed up. India comes with a target that is, you say, disappointing. It's 2 decades too late, many would say.
Yes, but what we're trying actually here to do is not have a reference point of the long term, because frankly, that's not going to cut it. What we really want is short term. And the short term emission reductions are actually coming from other sectors. It's coming from the finance sector. We have $130 trillion of wall of capital that is about to be deployed into clean technologies. That is going to move companies, that is going to definitely help to descend the emissions.
So with your experience of what happened in Paris and the success that was Paris, what is the most that can be achieved here before those regular updates?
What can be achieved here, and what I'm actually pretty confident that will be achieved, is actually a big push toward getting us closer and closer to being on a path of 1.5. It will not be guaranteed here, but we will get much closer.
Well, there is a lot of talking here in the hall behind us and over there, you know, what Greta Thunberg might call blah, blah, blah. And here's what those nations do. The UK is considering a new oil and gas project in the North Sea. The US issued 2,500 new oil and gas permits during the first 6 months of Joe Biden's presidency. Isn't Greta Thunberg entitled to say, this is blah, 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 what they're doing, there's a gulf between what they're doing and what they're saying?
There is definitely a gap. There's definitely a gap between policy and action. That is absolutely true. And yet, if you look at the trend, we're actually decarbonizing the economy. If you look at it project by project, you will always find examples of, let's call it, stepping back. But the fact is that we are moving forward. Renewables are so much more competitive. So we have to look at the trend, and we have to keep 1.5 front and center and 2030 as the deadline.
It's still too slow, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, last year you said we're in the nick of time. Are we still in the nick of time? Is it still 1 minute to midnight? Have we managed to stop the clock?
Yes, it is 1 minute to midnight. And I am only taking what science says. Science says we still are in the capacity to be able to do this. Here's the thing, Kathy. Are we responsible if we give up? If we now collectively say we cannot do that, is that something that we can all agree? Is that anything that we would actually, any of us, be willing to put our shoulders to? No.
And I know you're an incurable optimist, but just briefly, is it not now the time to be deeply pessimistic, and that might at least galvanize people into action?
I don't think so. I think we have to be deeply action-oriented and to take a look at the reality, and precisely because of reality, precisely because of the grief and the pain of young children, step into our working boots and get the task done.
Christiana Figueres, thank you very much for joining us. John, back to you.